All right, welcome back everyone to the deep dive. We always love getting your input on what we should explore, and this one's a really interesting one.
Yeah.
Came straight from our listeners. It has to do with a fatty acid you might not have heard of. It's called C15.
Okay.
Some people call it pentadecanoic acid too.
Yeah.
And you guys sent us some really interesting information about this C15, and we thought it would be helpful to, really unpack what it's all about. We've got a good mix of stuff from you. Some folks mentioned seeing it in clinical studies, while others sent over more like general guides and things. So we want to sort of extract what's most important and hopefully clear up any confusion.
Exactly.
What are the potential benefits? Where does C15 come from?
Yeah.
And, what could it mean for your well-being? And to make this deep dive even better, we have our expert here, ready to share some really deep insights.
Oh, well, thank you.
So why don't we start with the basics? What exactly is C15?
So C15, it's, as you said, also known as pentadecanoic acid, and it is what we call an odd chain saturated fatty acid.
Okay.
Now, that odd chain bit is actually super important because, unlike the saturated fats that we hear about all the time, the more common ones, those have an even number of carbon atoms, right?
Yeah.
But C15, it has 15.
Okay.
So that odd number, it means that it's got different chemical properties,
Gotcha.
It acts a little differently in the body.
Interesting.
And you can find it naturally in a few things. You've got your full-fat dairy products.
Oh.
So things like butter and whole milk.
Okay.
Some fish as well.
Oh, interesting.
And even some plants.
Oh, okay.
But you tend to find it in smaller amounts in the plant sources.
I see. Now, when we hear saturated state, I think a lot of us automatically kind of think, uh-oh.
Right.
Red flag. But from what you all have sent in, it seems like C15 might be a different story.
You're absolutely right. That's a key thing to point out here. You see, your typical even chain saturated fat, it basically acts as energy storage. That's its primary role. But C15, with its odd chain structure, it seems to interact with the actual cellular machinery.
Oh, wow.
It offers some anti-inflammatory and metabolic benefits that go way beyond just calories.
Okay.
And that's really important. That's what makes it so special.
So why is everyone suddenly talking about C15?
Right.
It seems like it's kind of new to the health scene, wouldn't you say?
It is. I mean, a lot of the buzz we're seeing is thanks to the work of Dr. Stephanie Van Watson. Have you heard of her?
I haven't.
Well, she's not just a veterinary epidemiologist.
Wow.
She's also the co-founder and CEO of Serafina Therapeutics.
What?
And she's got a super impressive track record. We're talking over 60 peer-reviewed publications and book chapters.
That's incredible.
Her clinical studies have been hugely influential in getting people to pay attention to C15. And it's not just her. There are more and more clinical studies, more scientific papers, all looking into C15 now. It's really becoming a hot topic.
Wow, so it sounds like there's a real concerted effort to understand this.
Definitely.
And then potentially help people through this.
Exactly. There's real potential here.
That's fascinating. Now, you guys also sent us some stuff about what happens when our C15 levels are low. What does the research say about the potential health implications of a deficiency?
Well, we're learning more all the time, but what we're seeing is the lower your circulating C15 levels, the more likely you are to experience certain health problems.
Oh.
For example, there's an increased risk of metabolic syndrome. That's that cluster of conditions that can lead to some pretty serious stuff. Heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes.
Okay.
We're also seeing connections to higher levels of inflammation throughout the body. And then you've got insulin resistance, where your cells don't respond to insulin like they should.
Right.
And get this, even faster cellular aging. Some studies have even linked low C15 levels to a higher risk of developing chronic diseases like heart disease and type 2 diabetes.
Oh, wow.
So it's definitely something to pay attention to.
That's pretty significant. So on the other hand, what happens if you have enough C15 or even higher levels? What does the research say about that?
Well, the flip side is actually pretty encouraging. Higher C15 levels seem to be associated with some really good things.
Okay.
We're seeing better metabolic health markers, possibly a longer health span. And get this, a lower risk of those same chronic diseases we just talked about.
Okay.
So it really looks like having enough C15 could be crucial for overall well-being.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So given, I guess, how a lot of us eat these days,
Right.
What are some of the things that might be leading to these lower C15 levels?
Well, a lot of it comes down to our modern diet, right? I mean, the most obvious factor is not eating enough of those natural C15 sources, like the full-fat dairy, the fatty fish. And then you've got the whole processed food thing. So many people eat highly processed, low-fat diets, which often, intentionally strip out the fats.
Right.
And that includes C15. And then, of course, you've got people who are vegan or dairy-free.
Yeah.
And unless they're, really carefully planning their meals, they could be missing out on C15, too.
Oh, see.
Because while there are some plant sources, they tend to be lower.
Gotcha.
And then let's not forget about all the processed vegetable oils out there. Those don't have much C15. And they might actually be replacing foods that do.
So if someone's listening and thinking, maybe my C15 levels are low, what can they do about it? What are some of the things they can try?
Okay, well, first of all, don't panic. There are definitely things you can do.
Okay, good.
A lot of it comes down to diet, making some changes.
Okay.
So, start incorporating some full-fat dairy. Think butter, ghee, cheese.
Right.
And if you can, go for the grass-fed stuff. There's some research that suggests it's got a better fatty acid profile.
Yeah.
Another thing you can do is eat more fatty fish. Things like salmon, sardines. Those are great sources. And then we've got C15 supplements. You might have seen them. They're often marketed as fatty 15. Just make sure to check the label for pentadecanoic acid, just to be sure you're getting the right thing. Supplements are a really good option for people who are vegan or maybe can't get enough C15 from their diet.
Okay.
The main takeaway is be aware of those really restrictive diet trends.
Yeah.
They could be limiting your C15 intake without you even realizing it.
Makes sense. So we've talked about what C15 is and why it's becoming so popular, but let's get into the details.
Yeah.
What exactly does it do in the body? What are the actual benefits?
Okay, so this is where the research gets really interesting.
Okay.
We've already mentioned the anti-inflammatory stuff, and that's a big one. Studies are showing that C15 can help lower overall inflammation in the body.
Right.
And we know that inflammation is linked to a whole bunch of chronic diseases. So that's a good sign. Plus, we're seeing some really positive effects on metabolic markers.
Like what?
Well, people with higher C15 levels tend to have lower triglycerides, better insulin sensitivity, and they're better at regulating their blood sugar.
That's huge, especially with so many people struggling with metabolic health these days.
Right. It's a big deal.
What about heart health? What does the research say about C15 in the heart?
That's a great question, and there's definitely some promising evidence there.
Okay.
Of course, more long-term studies would be great.
Right. Always.
But the observational studies we have so far show that people with higher C15 levels are less likely to develop heart disease.
Interesting.
Now, we have to remember these are just correlations,
Yeah.
Doesn't prove cause and effect, but it's definitely an interesting trend that keeps popping up.
For sure. And then there's the whole longevity thing.
Right. The possibility that C15 could be a biomarker for longevity, for how long and how well we live.
That's fascinating. Can you tell me more about that connection?
Well, it seems like part of how C15 might be linked to longevity is through its effects on our cells, specifically on the mitochondria.
Oh, okay.
The mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell, right?
The energy factories.
Exactly. And C15 seems to help them work better, produce more energy, and fight off that damaging oxidative stress.
Wow.
It also looks like C15 helps with cellular repair processes.
Interesting.
And it's not just about the mitochondria. C15 seems to be important for the overall health of our cells. It strengthens cell membranes.
Okay.
It improves how cells communicate with each other. And it basically helps our cells resist that age-related damage.
Wow.
There's even some early research suggesting it could support a healthy immune response.
So it's not just about avoiding all saturated fats. It seems like this particular one might actually be good for us.
You got it.
Yeah.
It really challenges that old idea that all saturated fats are bad,
Right.
The way our bodies process different types of saturated fats can lead to very different outcomes.
That's a good point. Let's go back to those food sources for a second.
Okay.
Can you remind everyone what some of those key foods are and about how much C15 they have?
Absolutely. So your whole fat dairy products like milk and cheese, they usually have between 0.3 and 1.0 grams of C15 per 100 grams.
Okay.
Butter, especially the grass-fed kind, tends to have more, around 0.8 to 1.5 grams per 100 grams. And then you've got some meats. Grass-fed lamb can have about 0.3 to 0.6 grams per 100 grams, and beef liver comes in at about 0.2 to 0.5 grams. Even regular grass-fed red meat has usually somewhere between 0.1 and 0.4 grams per 100 grams.
Okay.
And don't forget about full-fat yogurt and kefir. They can have anywhere from 0.3 to 0.9 grams per 100 grams.
And you mentioned that the grass-fed and minimally processed stuff is better.
Right.
Why is that?
Well, animals raised on pasture, they tend to have a better nutritional profile overall. And that often includes higher levels of those good fats like C15. Okay.
And of course, the less processing, the better, because it helps preserve those naturally occurring nutrients.
So based on the research, is there like a recommended amount of C15 people should be aiming for each week?
That's a good question. So there isn't an official RDA for C15 just yet,
Okay.
but some studies suggest that you should try to get at least 0.3 to 0.5 grams per day.
Yeah.
And they say you can probably reach that goal by eating 2 to 3 servings of grass-fed beef or liver each week. Plus, having some butter, full-fat yogurt, or aged cheese regularly.
Okay.
And of course, supplements are another way to go.
Right.
But it's really important to emphasize whole food sources.
Yeah.
And to avoid going overboard with saturated fat from those ultra-processed foods.
Makes sense. You also mentioned a few scientific papers that have been really important in understanding C15.
Yeah.
Can you remind us what those were again?
Sure. So there's one from 2020 by Brenna and his colleagues. It was published in Nature's Scientific Reports.
And they actually propose that we should consider C15 an essential fatty acid
Oh, wow.
because of its role in cell membrane and mitochondrial health.
Interesting.
Then there's a 2014 review by Fleming and Chris Etherton in Nutrition Reviews. And they talked about how C15 is different from those longer chain saturated fats that we worry about.
Right.
And they highlighted all the potential benefits.
Okay.
And lastly, there's a 2021 review by Mitchell and his team. They found some pretty significant connections between high C15 levels and a lower risk of metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, and cardiovascular disease.
It really seems like there's more and more evidence supporting the benefits of C15. And it's really impressive to see researchers like Dr. Ven Watson, with her expertise and dedication to good science, leading the charge. It makes these findings even more compelling.
I agree. I think her work and the growing interest in C15 from the scientific community is a really big deal. It shows that our understanding of dietary fats is evolving, and it could have a huge impact on how we approach our health.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive into the world of C15. It certainly changed my perspective on saturated fats. So to wrap things up, what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
To recap, C15, or pentadecanoic acid, is an odd-chain saturated fatty acid that seems to have a whole bunch of potential benefits. We're talking about things like improved metabolic health, better immune function, and stronger cells.
Right.
And emerging research is showing that not having enough C15 could be a problem for our health. On the other hand, having enough seems to be linked to some really positive outcomes. You can find C15 naturally in full-fat dairy, some meats, especially the grass-fed kind.
Okay.
And you can also take supplements if you need to.
And something that you shared from another podcast that I thought was interesting was welcome listeners to Centenaria's podcast and to the discussion of a potential fatty acid essential for health and longevity. It really does seem like the way we think about certain fats like C15 and how they impact our long-term health is changing, and that's pretty exciting.
I think so too. We're starting to realize that not all fats are created equal, and some of them, like C15, might actually be crucial for living a longer, healthier life.
So considering all this new research on C15, it really makes you think, do we need to change how we view healthy fats? And what role could C15 play in your own health journey?
Yeah.
It's definitely something worth exploring and, talking to your doctor about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.